Milo stretched across the scattered case files, his paws pushing aside ink-stained paper. Across the desk, Oliver remained motionless, eyes locked on the dense text of a leather-bound book. The office was defined by the rhythm of the wall clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was a constant, reliable pulse in the dim room. Then the pendulum froze mid-swing. It hung in the air, defying gravity, suspended in a sudden, suffocating silence. The air grew heavy, pressing against the window panes like a physical weight. Milo stood up, his fur bristling along his spine. He hissed at the wall. The clock hand jerked violently to the left. Tock, tick. The gears groaned, a metallic protest. Oliver dropped his book, the thud echoing through the now distorted space. The second hand swept backward, carving through the seconds. Oliver stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, but the clock continued its relentless retreat. The room was no longer measuring time. It was unraveling it. The office door groaned open before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. A woman stood in the threshold, her knuckles white, as she gripped a pocket watch. She stepped inside, her breathing shallow and jagged. She placed the watch on the desk. Its hands were spinning counterclockwise in a frantic blur. "Every clock in my house reversed at midnight," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the office clock still ticking backward. Before Oliver could speak, the door opened again, then a third time. By noon, the office was crowded with people, each carrying a stopped or retreating timepiece. They stood in silence, their eyes wide, watching the wall clock as if it were a judge. Oliver moved among them, comparing the watches. Every single one had stopped at the exact same moment. He collected the metal devices, stacking them on the desk until the pile hummed with a discordant backward rhythm. The city was losing its grip on the present. He grabbed his heavy outer layer from the rack and whistled for Milo. The kitten leaped from the desk, landing silently on the floor. Oliver looked at the crowd, then at the door. The time for observation had ended. It was time to find the source. Oliver stepped out into the street, the door clicking shut behind him. A thick, unnatural fog clung to the pavement, swirling around his boots like rising water. It was dense, muffling the usual sounds of the city until the world felt small and contained. Milo trotted ahead, his nose twitching as he navigated the shifting grey haze. They moved through the narrow corridors of the district, where the buildings seemed to lean inward, blocking out the sky. Every turn felt deliberate, guided by a low, rhythmic vibration that Oliver felt in his teeth rather than heard. They passed empty storefronts and silent street lamps that flickered with a dying yellow light. The fog grew colder, biting at their skin. They reached a dead-end alley, the ground littered with rusted scrap and broken glass. At the very end, a structure leaned precariously against a brick wall. A wooden sign hung above the entrance, swaying on a single hinge. It creaked, a sharp, metallic protest against the wind that cut through the silence. Oliver stopped, his hand hovering over the door handle. The source was just beyond the wood. He took a breath, pushed the door, and stepped into the dark. The interior was a graveyard of mechanical time. Hundreds of clocks covered every square inch of the walls, their pendulums swinging in a frantic, disjointed rhythm that defied logic. Some ticked forward, others hammered backward, and many simply ground against their own gears in a high-pitched, metallic screech. The sound was not a melody. It was a physical weight, a grinding symphony that vibrated through the floorboards and into Oliver's boots. Milo stopped dead in the center of the room, his back arched, his fur standing on end until he looked twice his size. His tail tucked tight against his belly and his ears swiveled frantically, trying to isolate a single sound from the cacophony. He hissed at a grandfather clock that was vibrating violently against the wall. Oliver stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, dusty light. The air tasted of ozone and ancient grease. Every second that passed felt like a collision of conflicting moments. He took a cautious step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He signaled for Milo to stay close, his hand resting on the handle of his walking stick. The cacophony of the shop seemed to bend around them as they moved deeper into the room. Milo led the way, his movements low and fluid, his eyes locked on the far corner of the workspace. He stopped abruptly, his ears twitching as he caught a sound that cut through the grinding gears. It was not the mechanical tick of a clock, but a soft, rhythmic whispering. Oliver followed the kitten, his hand brushing against the cold metal frames of wall-mounted timepieces. They reached a heavy, dust-covered velvet curtain hanging from a rusted rod in the corner. Milo sat down, his tail twitching, his gaze fixed on the dark seam of the curtain. With a sharp, decisive motion, he pulled the fabric aside. The curtain slid back, exposing the small, hidden alcove. The old man did not look up. He remained hunched over the workbench, his knuckles white as he gripped a golden pocket watch. He was forcing the mainspring to turn counterclockwise, his fingers trembling with a frantic, repetitive energy. Disassembled brass gears and tiny springs lay scattered across the wood like debris from a shipwreck. Oliver stepped into the small, cramped alcove, his boots crunching on discarded screws. He reached out to touch the man's shoulder, but the air around the workbench surged with a static charge that made his skin prickle. The old man muttered something, his voice cracking, a desperate plea directed at the golden casing. "I only wanted to return to the day she left," he whispered. The gears inside the watch shrieked, a sound like grinding teeth. Oliver stood his ground, his gaze hardening. The old man finally looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He clutched the watch tighter, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The air in the alcove vibrated with the frantic backward pulse of the golden watch. Oliver tried to reach forward, but the static charge intensified, snapping against his skin like a whip and forcing him to recoil. The old man ignored the sparks, his focus entirely on the mainspring, his fingers working with a desperate, mechanical precision that defied natural limits. Every clock in the room responded to the watch, their gears grinding in a cacophony of reverse motion. Then, a small, dark shape moved. Milo launched himself from the floor, landing silently on the cluttered workbench amidst the scattered brass components. He did not hesitate. The kitten moved with fluid grace, ignoring the ozone-heavy air that made his fur stand on end. He trotted across the workbench, his eyes locked on the golden object in the man's grip. The old man gasped, his hands shaking, but he did not pull away. Milo reached out, extending a soft, velvet paw. He pressed it firmly onto the surface of the golden watch. The effect was instantaneous. The grinding gears shrieked one final time and locked into place. The frantic, unnatural ticking vanished. A heavy, absolute stillness descended on the shop. Oliver moved into the space, his boots crunching on the discarded screws that littered the floor. He knelt beside the workbench, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. The man remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the golden watch beneath the kitten's paw. "The past is a fixed point," Oliver said. "You cannot rewrite it, but you can carry the memory without the burden of the gear." The old man let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. The tension finally broke. He loosened his grip on the golden casing. As his fingers relaxed and fell away, the kitten lifted his paw. Across the walls, hundreds of clocks began to chime in unison. The gears engaged with a smooth, synchronized hum. The man wiped his face with a rag, his movements slow and weary, and nodded once. The frantic energy dissipated. Oliver turned away from the workbench, his footsteps echoing against the floorboards as he headed toward the exit. Milo jumped down from the table, landing softly, and trotted close to his heels. They stepped out of the shop and into the cool, damp air of the alleyway. The fog had thinned, revealing the sharp, clear lines of the city buildings against the night sky. They walked in silence, the rhythm of their movement steady and unhurried. Back at the office, the door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the remnants of the day. Oliver moved to his desk, his hand brushing the surface as he settled into his chair. The wall clock stood tall, its pendulum swinging with perfect, unwavering precision. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Milo climbed onto the desk, weaving between the stacks of files before finding his favorite spot. He curled into a tight, soft ball, his eyes closing as he began to purr. The room felt anchored, grounded in the present. The chaos had dissolved, leaving behind only the quiet, predictable flow of time.